Thank you for listening to Depictions Media Radio. Welcome back to Depictions Media Radio. I'm your host, Michael Clogs. And in this next segment, we're going to hear from the Federal Environment Commissioner as he presents a spring report. Jerry DeMarco, the Federal Environment and Sustainable Development Commissioner, holds a news conference on Parliament Hill following the tabling of his latest spring reports. The 5 reports include audits on the federal government's carbon pricing and hydrogen strategies, the transition to a low carbon economy and supports for affected workers, efforts to achieve a net zero emissions by 2050, and investments into a climate-ready infrastructure. As we know that the Liberal government has not met a climate action goal as yet, and time is closing in on the fact that we need to change some of the things that we're doing so that we are living in a low carbon environment where we're not emitting as much carbon into the air, and that we're getting cleaner fuel sources so that we're not releasing that amount of carbon. There have been a lot of criticisms from the NDP and the Conservatives about the climate actions that have been seen, and the fact that the Liberal government has yet to meet a goal. The Green Party is saying that the actions aren't going far enough, and that what they effectively have done is, with their latest goals, is cheapen the goals so that it looks like they're doing something instead of having us as a society lowering our carbon footprint.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. We are joined today by Senator McPhedran, MP Heather McPherson, MP Lindsey Matheson, and virtually by the Honorable Douglas Roche, and MP Elizabeth May will be possibly joining the press conference later as well. Once the opening remarks have finished, we will start with questions in the room before taking questions from the Zoom link. Nous allons commencer avec questions dans la salle, suivi par des questions sur la ligne. So, Senator McPhedran, I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you very much, Rachel. We'll be very brief this morning, but the purpose of our being here today is to send a polite, urgent, and very firm request to the Government of Canada to include parliamentarians and young leaders here in this country in the first meeting of the states parties to the relatively new UN treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons that is going to take place in Vienna from June 19th to the 22nd. We have heard nothing from our government about any participation of an observer delegation. There is no threat as great to the human race and to the planet as nuclear warfare. We cannot continue to ignore this as this serious threat. We have ample evidence from Putin, from North Korea, that this is real, this is imminent, and we must be taking action as a country. And I'm very honored to be joined today by colleagues from the House of Commons, Member of Parliament Heather McPherson, Member of Parliament Lindsey Matheson, and we may be joined by others if they're able to get away. We know that over 40 senators have signed the pledge of the Nobel laureate ICANN to work towards the abolition and the prohibition of nuclear weapons. We know that as many MPs have done the same thing, and the level of interest, the level of concern is high, is sincere. We are all prepared to participate. We need the government to make this opportunity possible. Thank you.
Should we move to
We could hear from one of Canada's former ambassadors on disarmament, also retired from the Senate of Canada, and a member of Parliament for Alberta, the Honourable Douglas Roche. We can't.
Thank you. Thank you very much for allowing me to participate in this meeting. And I want to give my full support to Senator McPhedran and Member of Parliament Heather McPherson in their efforts to have Canada represented at the first meeting of the states parties to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. This is extremely important. And, when I went into my kitchen this morning for breakfast and turned on the television, the very first headline I saw on TV this morning was, "Threat of nuclear war must not be underestimated." This was from Foreign Minister Lavrov of Russia. So once more, in this terrible this terrible war that we're living through in Ukraine, when these threats and the deaths and the explosions and all the horrible things that are happening, we're being threatened again with the use of nuclear weapons. So people really need to understand that the threat of nuclear weapons use is very real. And we have been plunged into a new world of disorder in which the long taboo on the use of nuclear weapons has been lifted. And this is sowing fear throughout the world and drawing attention to the need to reduce and eliminate nuclear weapons. For some 50 years, the Non-Proliferation Treaty has tried to do that through the legal obligation for states parties to negotiate the elimination of nuclear weapons. They have ignored that. And thus a humanitarian movement sprung up a few years ago, which resulted in negotiations at the United Nations for a new treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. And this treaty prohibits the possession of nuclear weapons, not just their use. And it was signed by 122 countries. It's now entered into force. It's been ratified by 60 countries. It's very much a living document on the international scene. And yet it has been resisted by the nuclear weapon states and by NATO and, by extension, Canada. I think at its heart, many in the Canadian government, the officials of the Canadian government, would like to have Canada participate in the treaty, but they're prohibited. They feel that they're prohibited from doing so by the strong stand taken by NATO and Washington particularly. So we have to stand up for what is right in the world, and what is right is to protect humanity. And Mr. Guterres, the Secretary General of the United Nations, is now meeting today in Moscow to make his efforts at trying to do something to ease the strain and end this war, has said that humanity remains one misunderstanding, one misstep, one miscalculation, one pushed button away from annihilation. That is a terrifying warning given by the Secretary General of the United Nations. Canada should heed this. Canada needs to, if it's not ready to join the treaty immediately, it should attend this first meeting in June in Vienna of all the states parties to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Our fellow members in NATO, Germany and Norway, have said that they will attend. There is no excuse for Canada not attending, and that delegation should comprise both officials from the government and parliamentarians. It is extremely important that parliamentarians be present to convey into the meeting in the ways that will be possible for them on side events, to convey the feeling, their understanding of how Canada and how nuclear weapons prohibition must proceed. And it's also very important for them to come back to Canada and tell Canadians, tell their constituents, tell the Parliament, the House of Commons and the Senate, what is going on in the world. So Canada could start a process of moving toward the treaty by stepping up its work in NATO. NATO is an obstacle to the treaty because NATO has said that nuclear weapons are the supreme guarantee of security. That NATO doctrine has to be changed, and Canada must work very hard to work with NATO to change its doctrine and then join the treaty as a full member of the Prohibition Treaty.
Thank you. I'd like to just start by saying what an incredible honor it is to have the Honourable Doug Roach with us today. He is a member of Parliament in the same riding that I am now a member of Parliament in, or he was a member of Parliament in the same riding, and is an incredible mentor for all of us who are working so hard on the disarmament file. I'd also like to thank Senator McFedrin for being with us today and raising her voice within the Senate. Today, I'm joined by my colleague Lindsey Matheson. So you will see that there are two New Democrats on this stage, but I think it's also important to recognize that there are members of almost every party within the House of Commons that very much support the work of nuclear disarmament, very much support what we are trying to achieve. And while they were not able to be with us today, their voices have been raised. We have heard their voices, and that they will continue to push within their caucuses, as Lindsey and I will continue to push within our caucus to move towards a nuclear-free world. Because I think now more than ever, we need to recognize, if there is ever a time that the world needs to recognize the importance of nuclear weapon disarmament, of the importance of prohibiting nuclear weapons in the world, it has to be now. It has to be this moment in time where a madman is able to threaten and blackmail the entire planet with the threat of nuclear war. Think of the precedent that sets in terms of global relations. Think about the precedent that sets in terms of going forward. When as a global community, we say that if you have a nuclear weapon, you can kind of do whatever you want. You can kind of get away with whatever you want. That is terrifying. That is a terrifying future that I don't want for my children, that I don't want for any of the children in Ukraine, that I don't want for anyone's children in this world. So we need to do what we can. Canada does have an important role to play, and that role needs to start by engaging in conversations, by being at the table, by being part of the discussions. The fact that the government has made no move to determine whether or not they will be sending an observation mission makes me feel like, in a way that's very similar to other things we've seen from the Liberal government, that they're just going to wait for the clock to run out. They're just going to try to time this out so that they don't have to actually respond to it. And we are here, and many other parliamentarians that stand with us are here to demand that the government take the step, make the decision, ensure that Canada, the government of Canada and the parliamentarians of Canada are present in Vienna to represent at the first members meeting of the TPNW. And if we can't sign on, as Doug said, we have to go as observers. Thank you very much. And I'll just pass it for some short comments to Lindsey.
Thank you very much. I also am incredibly honored to be on this stage with such incredible parliamentarians, leaders in this country. And I think what is key here is that Canada show that leadership. We've often been very critical of the government for saying all the things that people want to hear and yet not acting on them. And this is yet another example of that incredible leadership that we need to see in the world, and to have Canada step up and do its part. It's not easy. That political will, that political courage can be difficult. And as former Senator Roach had mentioned, that there are a lot of pressures in terms of NATO, but Canada has to have that political courage. Now is absolutely the time. I couldn't put it as eloquently as Heather has. If now, not when. So thank you very much.
Thank you. As we don't have any questions in the room, we will go directly to our questions from Zoom. Alors, lorsqu'il n'y a pas de questions dans la salle, nous allons prendre des questions sur Zoom. So our first question comes from Xiao Li from City News. Oh. Okay. Yeah, unless there's anyone who has any other questions who would like to raise their hand.
I don't have a question, but I do have a message to convey. We had 2 youth leaders that we were trying to bring into this news conference. It would have created a span of ages speaking out on this issue, but they're writing exams, and so it was too much to ask to skip the exam and come to the media conference. But I have been asked to convey the message from the younger generation of youth leaders. There's a high degree of awareness and strong concern among young leaders in this country. And what they see with the threat of nuclear war being so real and so close for them is that they can seriously contemplate no future. And as one of them said, if we don't end nuclear weapons, they will end us as an entire civilization. And so I'm a long way from being young, but on behalf of youth leaders in this country, I want to pass this message on. This is a generation deeply concerned, highly engaged, looking to the government that promised and has promised repeatedly to respect youth and to treat youth as the leaders of today, not tomorrow. And so I'm adding their voices to our voices as parliamentarians, urging a delegation of observers at minimum, and to include parliamentarians as well as youth from Canada to be present as part of this very important first meeting of state parties to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Thank you. Okay. Honorable Roche?
Yes, if I may say a word following what you said, Senator. Canada has a long record of involvement in nuclear disarmament issues, and one quickly recalls the efforts that Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau made in the 1980s by going around the world to the capitals of the nuclear weapon states, urging them to step down from the nuclear arms race at that time. And later on, I had occasion to work with former president of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev, and he told me that Mr. Trudeau's work had a strong influence on the Reagan-Gorbachev summits of the late 1980s, which produced the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, which was a ban on all intermediate nuclear weapons. And so there have been many instances in which Canada has taken a lead in disarmament areas and arms control. The Landmines Treaty was originally sponsored by Canada. The International Criminal Court was fathered by Canada. There have been strong instances in which Canada has taken a leadership role. So it's not right that Canada should absent itself or dismiss the importance of this new treaty, which came in 2017 as a result of the inaction of the nuclear weapon states to fulfill their obligations to humanity. And so the modern movement is based on the humanitarian recognition of the catastrophic humanitarian consequences that would result to the world as a result of a nuclear war, nuclear exchange. And that is precisely what we are being threatened with today. And so we have to see the signs of the times. And one of them is the arrival on the scene of the new treaty. As I've said, it's been signed by 122 states and ratified by 60. So this is not some sort of marginal thing. It's entering into the mainstream of international politics. And Canada should, at the very least, send an official observer to an observer team to this meeting. So I'm making a real effort, a plea here to the Canadian authorities to exercise their sense of responsibility to humanity that is made all the more evident and in greater need today as a result of the Ukrainian war.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Appreciate this.
Thank you. This ends our press conference.
On the video conference for questions, 1, 2, sound check.
Yeah, that's okay, Pierre. I can adjust the level here.
Valérie, tu peux transférer toutes les lignes de la téléconférence avec le son ambiant de la salle, s'il te plaît.
Parfait. Alors, vous allez entendre la musique brièvement. Dès que la musique est enlevée, c'est votre cue de débuter ou c'est pour vous indiquer que vous êtes dans l'appel.
C'est parfait. So we'll start when the music stops.
Wonderful. Thank you. I'm transferring you now.
This conference is being recorded. Cette conférence est enregistrée.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. Good morning. Bonjour à tous et tous. We are joined by Commissioner of the Environment and Sustainable Development, Jerry DeMarco. Once the opening remarks have finished, we will start with questions in the room before taking questions from the Zoom link. One question and one follow-up. Alors, nous allons commencer avec questions dans la salle, suivi par des questions sur la ligne, une question et une question en suivi. So, Commissioner, I'll pass the floor to you.
Thank you. Good morning, and thank you for joining me. I'm Jerry DeMarco, Canada's Commissioner of the Environment and Sustainable Development. I would like to acknowledge that we are on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe. Aujourd'hui, j'ai présenté au Parlement 5 rapports sur des programmes qui touchent les efforts. Aujourd'hui, j'ai présenté au Parlement 5 rapports sur des programmes qui touchent les efforts du gouvernement fédéral face à la crise climatique. L'automne dernier, j'ai fourni au Parlement un survol de la performance du Canada dans le dossier climatique et j'ai indiqué que des audits de programmes particuliers suivraient, comme ceux dont je vais parler aujourd'hui. Comme ces programmes sont en cours, mes rapports constituent une sorte de bulletin de mi-parcours qui devrait aider à améliorer les résultats, car le changement climatique ne s'arrête jamais. By auditing these programs at an early stage, our intent is to provide Parliament with useful information that can be used before the clock runs out. We cannot afford a fourth decade of failure on climate action. First, let's turn to carbon pricing, which is led by Environment and Climate Change Canada. As is recognized by the Supreme Court of Canada and many international organizations, effective carbon pollution pricing drives changes in consumer and producer behavior that in turn reduce overall greenhouse gas emissions. Carbon pricing is therefore essential if Canada is to finally succeed in significantly reducing its greenhouse gas emissions. We found that the department had ensured that carbon pricing systems were in place in all provinces and territories. In 2021, the department worked to address weaknesses in its initial approach that had allowed some less effective provincial carbon pricing systems to be accepted. However, the department did not fully address some shortcomings that could hinder the overall effort to meet Canada's emission reduction targets. For example, we found that the federal requirements for large emitters continue to undermine the polluter pays principle by approving weaker systems for large emitters in some parts of the country. In addition, Indigenous communities and some groups in society remain disproportionately affected by carbon pricing systems. Il faut continuer d'améliorer l'approche du Canada pour la tarification du carbone afin d'appuyer l'atteinte des cibles nationales de réduction des émissions. Il faut notamment veiller à produire des rapports transparents qui permettront aux Canadiens et aux Canadiennes de mieux comprendre l'efficacité et les répercussions des systèmes de tarification du carbone. Le Canada s'est engagé à réduire progressivement sa dépendance sur le combustible fossile et à favoriser une économie à faible émission de carbone pour atteindre la carboneutralité d'ici 2050. Il s'est aussi engagé à assurer une transition équitable pour les collectivités et les travailleuses et travailleurs touchés par ce virage économique. C'est le sujet du deuxième audit publié aujourd'hui. La combustion du charbon pour produire de l'électricité contribue de façon importante aux émissions de GES. L'élimination progressive du charbon est une première étape du plan du gouvernement pour effectuer la transition vers une économie à faible émission de carbone. Le gouvernement avait désigné Ressources naturelles Canada à titre de ministère responsable de présenter une loi sur la transition équitable en 2019. En ce qui concerne l'appui à une transition équitable vers une économie à faible émission de carbone, le gouvernement n'était pas bien préparé et a été lent à agir. Le ministère a peu fait pour avancer le dossier avant 2021. Il n'avait pas établi de plan de mise en œuvre pour gérer ce virage économique important qui touche une diversité de travailleuses et de travailleurs, de collectivités, de régions et de parties prenantes. We found that as Canada shifts its focus to low-carbon alternatives, the government is not prepared to provide appropriate support to more than 50 communities and 170,000 workers in the fossil fuel sector. Without a proper just transition plan in place, there are risks that are comparable to what occurred with the collapse of the northern cod fishery in Atlantic Canada in the 1990s. In the absence of a coordinated federal approach to support a just transition to a low-carbon economy, federal organizations relied on existing mechanisms, such as social assistance programs. These fell short of achieving a just transition for coal workers and the communities where they live. As the coal phase-out is the first of several transitions to a low-carbon economy facing Canadian workers, communities, and governments, there is an opportunity for the federal government to learn from this initial experience to improve future policies and programs. The future will involve changes at a much larger scale than the coal phase-out, so it is essential for Canada to make up for lost time and ramp up its approach to a just transition. Le troisième rapport publié aujourd'hui porte sur l'hydrogène. À mesure que la place des combustibles fossiles diminue dans le mélange des énergies consommées au Canada, l'attention se tourne vers l'hydrogène à titre de solution plus propre. Si le Canada ne projette pas adéquatement l'incidence de l'hydrogène dans le contexte de la réduction des émissions de GES, la capacité à atteindre les cibles nationales de réduction pourrait souffrir. Les deux ministères, Environnement et Changement climatique Canada et Ressources naturelles Canada, souscrivent à l'idée de cette source d'énergie propre. Mais ils ont adapté des approches différentes pour évaluer le rôle que l'hydrogène devrait jouer dans l'atteinte des cibles de réduction des émissions. Environnement et Changement climatique Canada estime que l'hydrogène pourrait amener l'équivalent d'une réduction de 15 mégatonnes de GES d'ici 2030, tandis que Ressources naturelles Canada estime que cette réduction pourrait atteindre jusqu'à 45 mégatonnes sur le même horizon. In its transformative scenario, Natural Resources Canada assumed the adoption of aggressive and sometimes non-existent policies along with an ambitious uptake of new technology. In our view, the assumptions in the federal hydrogen strategy are overly optimistic and compromise the credibility of the projected emissions reductions. This is concerning because Canada's greenhouse gas emissions have increased significantly since the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change was signed in 1992, making Canada the worst performer of all G7 nations since that time. As I noted in the fall, Canada has consistently failed to meet its climate targets, despite numerous plans and commitments. Going forward, Canada needs realistic goals, credible plans, and most importantly, effective actions. If hydrogen is to be part of Canada's plans to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, then Environment and Climate Change Canada and Natural Resources Canada will need to coordinate their approaches and more effectively model and communicate a pathway for hydrogen. Our fourth report is a snapshot of the Greening Government Strategy, launched by Treasury Board of Canada Secretariat in 2017. Federal government operations are a significant contributor to Canada's total emissions of greenhouse gases. We found that the Secretariat had taken initial steps to support departments' efforts to reduce the federal government's environmental footprint. However, 5 years into the strategy, efforts to reduce emissions are not as complete as they could be. This is important given Canada's publicly stated commitment to reach net zero emissions by 2050 and to be a national and global leader in transitioning to carbon-neutral government operations. At the time of our audit, 8 of 27 departments had created reduction plans covering 81% of departmental emissions. We looked at national defense, the largest emitter in government, and found that there was no clear information about how the department's efforts were contributing to the overall reduction target. The audit found that some important information on greening government was hard to find, unclear, or incomplete. There was also a lack of detail on costs and savings. And in addition, the emissions of Crown corporations were not part of the strategy. Overall, this lack of information makes it difficult for decision makers, Parliament, and Canadians to track whether the government will meet its 2050 target and whether Canada is actually being the global leader in greening government that it has set out to be. Il reste du travail à faire pour que la stratégie pour un gouvernement vert produise les résultats attendus et pour mettre en place des méthodes et des plans exhaustifs qui permettront de suivre la progression des réductions d'émissions et de rendre compte. Notre dernier audit a examiné si des programmes de financement sélectionnés avaient conduit à des investissements dans des infrastructures plus résilientes et inclusives et ayant une moindre intensité carbonique. Nous avons constaté qu'Infrastructure Canada avait conçu et mis en œuvre une façon d'évaluer si le projet financé était plus résistant aux effets des changements climatiques, comme les inondations et les feux de forêt qui deviennent plus fréquents, et s'il contribuait à réduire les émissions de GES. Dans la première version de l'optique de changement climatique, soit l'outil d'évaluation que le ministère a lancé en 2018, les gestionnaires de projets d'infrastructure devaient fournir des estimations détaillées des réductions d'émissions prévues en lien avec leur projet. Or, nous avons constaté que ces exigences avaient été abaissées lorsque l'optique de changement climatique a été révisée en 2021. Cela a eu pour conséquence de réduire la capacité du ministère à calculer la contribution des programmes de financement à l'atteinte des objectifs climatiques du gouvernement et en rendre compte. La détérioration de la qualité de l'information a été telle qu'Infrastructure Canada n'a pu établir avec exactitude les avantages prévus sur le plan de l'atténuation du changement climatique et de la résilience des projets qu'il finançait. Nous avons aussi constaté qu'Infrastructure Canada n'avait pas intégré les engagements du Canada envers les objectifs de développement durable des Nations unies dans la conception de ces programmes. Le ministère avait intégré l'analyse comparative entre les sexes+ dans la conception de ces programmes et recueilli des informations à ce sujet auprès des promoteurs de projets, mais elle n'avait pas mesuré ni déclaré de manière cohérente les résultats. S'il n'a pas d'informations fiables et complètes sur les avantages et les résultats attendus des projets financés, le gouvernement ne pourrait pas déterminer si ces investissements ont contribué à produire des infrastructures résilientes, à moindre intensité carbonique ou à atteindre ses engagements d'améliorer la diversité et l'inclusion. As I mentioned at the beginning of my remarks, the climate change clock never stops ticking. Some critical deadlines that the government has set for itself. I trust the findings and recommendations that I have brought forward today will help the government improve its performance in these areas of critical importance. Because climate change is an intergenerational crisis with a rapidly closing window for action, it is essential for Canada to translate its commitments and plans into real actions and results. Our future depends on it. Thank you. Merci. I am now ready for your questions.
This show has been produced by Depictions Media. Please contact us at depictions.media for more information.